Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You are watching User and Group Accounts and Files. There are two sides to the life of a Linux administrator. There's the glamorous side, which involves things like testing and evaluating new software or hardware, installing upgrades, or like our Global Mantic staff, making a total environment change. This is the type of stuff that drew us to the technology field in the first place. But then there's the other side. The tasks that, though still important, don't provide quite the same thrill. One of those tasks is user and group management. Linux is the ultimate multi-user environment, and through its user accounts, each user can be provided with their own desktop environment, settings, and permissions. Linux user accounts are really quite similar to their Windows counterparts. So besides a few differences in commands and settings that we'll point out in the lesson, this material really should feel pretty familiar. In this lesson, we'll begin with an introduction to Linux users and groups. We'll then move on to creating and changing user accounts. Then we'll review the same information for groups. Let's start our overview on the next slide. Part of the responsibilities of my first job was help desk administration, and many a network engineer and administrator have started their careers just the same way. Since this was a shared responsibility at one specific workstation, many people in turn share the same computer. We never really ran into any problems with files on that system, as we each had our own workstations as well, but this setup illustrates the potential problem. Say I stored a file on the computer and someone else accidentally came along and deleted it. Someone could also quite easily overwrite the file. This situation could quickly turn the tide on what was a previously harmonious workplace. Luckily, thanks to user accounts, we no longer have to worry about this problem. A new user sitting at that same workstation would simply log on with their own account and have no access to other users' data. Linux uses a simple authentication method requiring a username and password. And on some systems like my laptop, biometric technology like fingerprint scanners can also be used to log in. When deciding on a username scheme for your network, consider a few rules. Passwords are case sensitive, so vHenry with a lowercase v and vHenry with an uppercase V are treated as separate users. Also, usernames must begin with a letter, and they can contain symbols, though the space is one you probably shouldn't use. A common naming convention on networks is to have the first letter of the first name followed by the last name. But depending on the size of your network, you may run into duplicates with that approach. This is where the use of special characters and punctuation can come in handy. When a user account is created, the user is automatically assigned a user ID, and this information is stored in the file etc passwd. Let's switch over to a terminal window and take a quick look at this file. Okay, from here, let's type in cat space Etsy shadow and hit enter. Let's take a look at the last line here for J.A. Doe. Again, J.A. Doe is the username. Then we've got an encrypted password here, followed by, if it's set, the last password change date. Then we've got the number of days before a change is allowed, days before the change is required, any warning day setting before expiration, followed by days between expiration and deactivation. And we've got the last field for the actual expiration date or special flag. And again, if you see the colons here with no options, that means that this particular user doesn't have any of those options set. Now this is a file that you probably won't want to directly modify very often. Also, let's take a look here. If you look at user A. Jones and you see the exclamation point in front of the encrypted password, if you recall, we actually locked this user, so that's why you see the exclamation point here. And we did that with the usermod -L command. Let's go up and take a look at some of the other users on the system. Here's one that's Ben. If you see an asterisk, that indicates that this is a system account. So we know how to create a user and how to modify their settings. But what if we wanted to remove a user from the network? To delete a user, you use the command userdel or userdel. The syntax is userdel space options space username. And there are only 3 options. The first is -R or /remove, which removes all files from the user's home directory and mail spool. Since deleting without this option will leave all of those files intact. The next is -F or /force, which forces deletion while the user is logged in. If you recall with the usermod command, we talked about some of the potential issues with making changes to user accounts while they're logged in. And while a user is logged in, you can't normally delete them, so you need to use the -F option to do so. Then we have -H or /help, which lists all of the userdel options. Now let's go back to our terminal window and try to delete one of our test users. Okay, first I'm going to clear the screen. Now I'm going to type in userdel with no options for test user and hit enter. Now let's type in ls space /home and hit enter. As we can see, even though we deleted the user, his home directory still exists. So if we want to delete a user and their home directory and mail spool, we use the -R option. So let's type in userdel space -R space, and we'll pick on T. Smith and hit enter. Let's try that cat command again. We'll type in cat space Etsy PASSWD space pipe space grep, and we're going to search for the home directories and hit enter. And we should see now that our user T. Smith is gone. Let's try to look in the home directories again. Using the up arrow, we can go back to the command and hit enter, and we can see that also T. Smith's home directory has indeed been deleted. Now let's go back to the presentation and talk about groups. At Global Mantix, we have several departments, a few of which are accounting, developers, and administrators. To help organize users, you can put them into groups. And you can use groups to give them access to the same resources so they won't have to be configured individually. Consider a developers group that currently has 100 members. Now you can assign access to programs, directories, and other resources to this group and simply add users to the group, instead of individually going to 100 user accounts and setting up the individual permissions and access there. The command to add a group is simply group add, and the syntax is group add space options followed by group name. Though you probably won't often use the options, they are -G, which specifies a group ID, and like user IDs, these are usually unique, but if you want to share them, you need to use the -O option. Then you have the -R option, which creates a group ID of less than 500. Now this option is supported on Red Hat, but not many other distributions. Then you have -F, which forces creation of a group with an existing name. Let's go back to our terminal window and create a few groups. Since you'll normally use group add without any options, let's try that first. Type in group add space, we'll start out with accounting. And hit enter. Now let's try the group add with the -G option to specify a group ID. Group add space -G, let's make it 680. Space, and the name of the group we'll create as developers. And hit enter. Now just like users, groups have a file that contains all the information. So let's type in cat space etc, and the name of that file is group. And hit enter. And you can see at the bottom here that we have the two accounts that we just created. Accounting with the group ID of 603 and developers with the 680 group ID that we specify. You can see some other groups here. Okay, from the prompt, let's type in GROUPDEL space followed by the group name, and let's try our accounting group, as we indicated, ACCT, and hit enter. Let's use the cat command again, up arrow twice, and there it is, and hit enter, and we can see now that that group is gone. And we can also take a quick look at this graphically. Click on System, Administration, Users and Groups. Type in our root password and hit enter. And if we go to our group listing, again we see that our accounting group is gone. And that concludes our lesson on user and group accounts and files. Let's review what we learned on the next slide. In this lesson, we talked about the very important task of managing users and groups on your networks. And while there are graphical tools that you may find yourself using more often, the command line tools are indispensable. And the Linux Plus certification exams also focus on these tools. To recap what we learned, we started out with an introduction to Linux users and groups, then moved on to how to create and modify accounts for both users and groups. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.